Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, dead slicers, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks. I'm a Useful Idiot. Welcome. And today we're going to go global. And I thought this would make a nice companion piece to my previous video on the American election cycle, a giant circus of lies. Because we also have the global financial system, which is also a giant circus of lies. And it's really astounding that we find ourselves in this place where all of this massive fraud and manipulation in the entire economic system at every level has been discovered and continues to go on, and yet everything just continues to go on, and it's like nothing ever happened. And we have the proof because we have all the too big to fail banks, both in Europe and in the United States and all kinds of places all over the globe that have been fined billions and hundreds of billions. And I've done previous videos on that. We even have JP Morgan with felony counts against them. And yet, part of course, the giant global system of lies in our financial system is that all this crime goes on and nobody goes to jail. And one argument I made recently was, according to Citizens United, corporations are people. And therefore, I put forth the idea that if a corporation, for example, a bank, is a person and is allowed to contribute to our election campaigns, then they are people in the eyes of the law as well. And if JP Morgan bank is convicted of felons, then every single person that works for JP Morgan, hundreds of thousands of people, should probably be put in jail. But anyway, I digress. So anyway, one of the indications, of course, that this fraud continues to go on and on and on is the fact that just as late as September 2015, we find out that 2/3 of a certain type of treasury auction were rigged, and it includes the usual suspects: Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley. Treasury traders at these banks would pre-share customer moves to other trading desks. So not only has that story come out recently, but we also have the manipulated currency markets. And I'll attach all this material below. In currency markets, we even have players on tape saying, quote, "If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying," unquote. I don't know how much more damning evidence we need to put somebody in jail than statements like that we have in emails and documents going back for the last 20 or 30 years. But so we have currency markets manipulated. We have treasury markets manipulated. We have high frequency trading, which involves stocks, bonds, options, currencies, commodities. That's also a form of front running, and it's technically illegal, and yet it goes on and continues to manipulate the market, manipulate stock prices. And then, of course, we have the stock buybacks, which I've mentioned, where all these corporations have been buying back all their huge stock purchases in order to manipulate and inflate the prices of their stocks, and of course increase their bonus packages. Then we have the derivatives market is completely manipulated. There's varying numbers that are thrown around out there. One of them is $1 quadrillion, $200 trillion in derivatives worldwide, and of course 90% of that is the too big to fail banks that have a monopoly on, basically monopoly on that kind of business, and they manipulated by self-reporting. That's another problem with all this crime, corporate crime all over the globe, is most of the reporting is done themselves and is on a voluntary basis. So you can see how that would work out. And that's just like the interest rates. And so there's a lot of front running on these credit default swap trades, and there's manipulating decisions in order to trigger payouts, like they did with Greece. They actually set Greece up to fail, then they manipulate the markets to make them fail, and then they collect the money. Then we have energy prices manipulated. We know that's been going on back all the way to Enron, who were enabled by all the big banks. And then we find out that JP Morgan was involved in energy fraud in California and the Midwest, in much the same way that Enron was, and yet there's no criminal charges against JP Morgan for that. And then oil prices, of course, have been manipulated for years, just like all commodity prices. And so that's no big surprise there. And then, like I bring up, commodities are manipulated. Commodity prices have been manipulated for decades, scalping and buying physical operations and infrastructure in order to facilitate controlling the commodities prices at all different junctures. And of course, we know stories about banks storing huge amounts of commodities, and then in order to inflate and manipulate the prices. Then, of course, we know gold and silver has been manipulated for decades, if not longer. Prices are fixed in these daily conferences they have, and price fluctuations follow a pattern, so we know they're being manipulated. Interest rates, of course, have been manipulated. Here we had LIBOR, the largest insider trading scandal in world history, the largest financial scam in world history, and yet not only is it still going on, but nobody went to prison for it. Even in all these local governments continue to get burned and ripped off by these interest rate manipulations, and there's an $800 trillion market in assets that are pegged to these interest rates. So once again, manipulation on a massive scale. And then, of course, cooking the books, the time-honored tradition of just lying on your books is another form of ripoff, because we don't know market value of anything anymore, the way that banks manipulate the assets and liabilities on their books. And once again, the cooking the books for corporations is also a way to hide their profits and losses to avoid taxes and avoid liabilities. And then, the list goes on, just the daily stuff, all the little things that are going on that have nothing to do even necessarily with the big scandals, and that includes enabling these Ponzi schemes. All the big banks are involved in facilitating these Ponzi schemes, like the Bernie Madoff one. They had known for years, and they participated in it. Once again, nobody goes to prison except for the guy that started the Ponzi, and everybody that facilitated him walks. Unlawful mortgage fees, bribing and bullying agencies to inflate ratings. We know that the corporations and banks have bullied all the rating agencies to make sure all their garbage got top ratings, and that's certainly a form of fraud and corruption. Front running and wash trades, like I mentioned. Just the cottage industry of pushing bad investments is another form of fraud and corruption. Gaming foreclosure laws, multiple customer mortgages, where banks and mortgage servicing companies were involved in selling mortgages to multiple customers at the same time. Just overall mortgage fraud at the buying end and the foreclosing end. Storage fees for gold without even buying or storing any gold. Shaving off pennies on the dollar in all the pension transactions, another global and massive amount of fraud and corruption by the banks and corporations. And big bid rigging in government contracts, laundering money for terrorists, laundering money for drug cartels. It's funny that the big banks will launder hundreds of millions and billions of dollars for drug cartels, but they won't handle the cash generated by legal marijuana businesses in the United States. And then, of course, we're helping hide the big banks. Corporations are all involved with each other, hiding their money and creating tax havens, another form of corruption and fraud. And then, of course, all the money that's handled for all these rogue militaries and rogue governments all over the world. And then, of course, banks are involved in financing illegal arms deals as well. So, and part of it is just the fact that not only do we have all these corporations and banks and the whole financial system riddled with fraud and corruption. Fraud is the business model, but we also have all the regulatory agencies that are supposed to have oversight, like the SEC, is completely captured by the banks. And over the last 5 or 10 years, we've gotten plenty of evidence of that as well, that basically the corporations and the banks call the shots, and the SEC is just a puppet for them. And no surprise with the revolving doors between the corporate industry, the banking industry, and the U.S. government, that we find ourselves in this situation. And this whole idea that they throw these little fish out there occasionally to patronize the American public, that bankers are being prosecuted, when in fact studies show that most of the fraud is committed by management. And anybody that's paying any attention, anybody has any common sense, already knows that all this stuff comes from the top. Look at the London whale, J.P. Morgan. Once all the litigation is stopped, I mean, he comes out and admits that all the orders to do that trade came from the top and probably go all the way up to Jamie Dimon, and yet Jamie Dimon is still walking the streets. And then not to mention the fact that the ultimate fraud and corruption is that virtually all bank profits come from continuous taxpayer bailouts, including parking their reserves at the Federal Reserve and also moving from traditional banking to mostly speculation. And at the heart of all this corruption and fraud, of course, we have the very hub and axis of all the fraud and corruption in the global financial system that is fostered and encouraged by the policies of the central banks, most notably the Federal Reserve. So needless to say, just kind of a general overview and a reminder to everyone that the entire global financial and economic system is built on fraud and corruption, like our government. So no surprise that they work together hand in hand to maintain their cartels and their criminal operations that benefit both of them. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.